As someone who has researched this thoroughly, I'd like to get your thoughts on that claim that the Gospels and Revelation are the works of unknown Christians. Is this true? And is it a big deal if the titles weren't actually in the original Gospel autographs?
Okay, that's a huge question, and there's a lot we could go into there, but the short answer is no, it's not true. Now, Revelation is a little different from the Gospels because, like you said, it has the author's name in it. It's John in chapter 1. Now, who that John is exactly is discussed, but let's start with the Gospels. There are a couple of ways to think about this idea that the Gospels are anonymous. So, if by anonymous you mean that the author's name isn't in the Gospel, like he didn't write his name in the text, then sure. You think about artists who put their names in their songs. There's not an awful lot of them. And I'm an old guy, so I'm thinking of things like, my name is Kid Rock, or, you know, uh, Hammer Time. MC Hammer
Yeah.
had Hammer Time back in the day, when I was in junior high. So
Yeah.
there's not an awful lot of songs that I can think of where the artist puts their name in the song. So does that mean that the other songs are anonymous because that artist didn't put their name in those songs? No. And if you try to use a Kid Rock song or something like MC Hammer's song that doesn't have the name in it on your YouTube channel, you're still going to get a copyright strike, right? Because YouTube knows that that's a Kid Rock song, or MC Hammer's song is copyrighted. So in that sense, it's not like just because the name's not there, we have no idea who wrote it. We can see that even in the modern times when we think of things like songs like that. Now, the second way to think about this, the Gospels being anonymous, is that we don't know who wrote them. And that's often what people kind of conflate together. It's like, well, the name's not in the text, so it's anonymous, i.e. we have no idea who wrote them. And that's just not the case. It's one thing to say we don't know who wrote them. It's another thing to even say, for sure, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write these. Because if you don't know who wrote them, well, for all you know, they wrote them, right? Some people like Bart Ehrman and other scholars will say these are outright forgeries. Now, it's true the original manuscripts probably didn't have the names of the gospel authors on them, the titles. These were probably added in the 2nd century when people came to know about a certain gospel because maybe they only had one. And then they're like, oh, there's another account that was written in another region, another area. We use that in our church now. And so we got to make a distinction. Like, we only have one car and in my family. And if we bought a new car, that would probably be my wife's car. So I could tell my son right now, I could tell him just take the car because we only have one. But if we had 2 cars, I could say, why don't you take mom's car? Mom's car will probably be the new one. So the thing is, we don't have the original autographs, so we can't actually say whether or not the titles were there. But so then you ask, is it a big deal if the titles weren't actually in the original Gospels? And no, for a couple of reasons. I think it's not a big deal when you know about how people wrote back in the day.
Yeah.
I think last time we were having a chat, we talked about culture and how, Jesus culture wasn't our culture and Jesus culture in the 1st century, not Bethel writing.
Just to differentiate and continue with that. Yeah.
So it's not a big deal when you figure out that the way people wrote back in the day isn't the way we write today. Mike Licona is a scholar that your listeners and viewers might know about. He was on my dissertation committee, and full credit goes to him for this observation. When you take all of the biographies that were written in the 1st century, none of them actually have the author's name anywhere in the text. If you push it out to after the 1st century, you can find one exception in the 2nd century, and then you have to fast forward all the way to the 4th century before you even get another exception. And so it just wasn't a common thing to do back in the day, much like it's not common to put your name in the song if you're an artist writing a song today. It happens, but it's quite rare,
That's a very interesting connection. Yeah.
So way after the time of Jesus, we're talking 4th century, there's an exception. 2nd century, there's one exception. Another thing that Mike pointed out has to do with a Greek historian by the name of Plutarch. And Mike has done some good work with Plutarch. He's probably one of the greatest ancient biographers. He was writing around 100 AD. And that's a few decades within when the Gospels were written. And he wrote 60 biographies we have 48 of them. And here's why he's important.
Hmm.
You know how many times he puts his name in the 48 writings that we do have? Zero.
I was just going to say 0. I was just guessing.
Not a one.
Interesting.
So that's not a big deal. That's how they wrote in their culture.
Well,
Now
how
we
did you know
know,
that? How would you know that he wrote it then?
yeah, that's an excellent question.
Yeah.
The reason we know that he wrote these things is because other people quote him. And
Hmm.
other people, other historians
Oh.
will say, as Plutarch said in this text, in his life of so and so, or by making a list of his works.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like how we have the Gospels written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the church fathers passing that information on. Papias,
Oh,
Irenaeus,
interesting.
Justin Martyr. So they'll quote the Gospels, they'll quote the evangelists, and then you know, make mention of their name there, even though we don't have the originals to check and see if their name was actually in a title on there. Certainly it wasn't in the text per se, but in the title, we don't know if there were titles on there before the 2nd century.
Yeah.
So that's one reason it's not a big deal if the gospel writers' names weren't on the original autographs.
Yeah. I have to say, Mikhail, I think that's one of the best explanations I've heard to date on why the names aren't there. The examples you gave made a lot of sense to me, particularly Mike Laconia's example. That's very interesting. Don't you think it's interesting that they would, skeptics or whoever, only focus on the Gospels, but forget that, oh, this is just, everybody did that. So why are we going to debunk them and say that those aren't true and only focus on that, but forget the fact that it's kind of like the argument that you just made that, 2000 years from now, we can't say that Kid Rock, or we can say that Kid Rock wrote that song because his name is in it, but all these other songs, we have no idea who sang them,
Right?
because their name isn't in it. That's a very good example. And I'm glad you broke it down that way. Very good. Lots of light bulb moments. Thank you for that.